Falter Road, I can then check and show for Kenny and Kent show not. By Liz a Kent Fui and Cogushian, by Cavill Tim, by Tim a Kent Asgilga Fui Foster. Or dus Furmar, Rillamar, Alan, Kent and Shaw, August Neve Paul, Donegal Celtic casement for Star Nahuran, Star Eichel, August Narodi Marshen, August Tomajak Sminu Fui Alan, Avansala, Marshen, well, Ian Sminu, Akandenya for Kenya, Kansha, Kirk Kest, Kirskor Jormsa, Mickey Dak, Paddy or Tim. Or do so by Tim McCanch and Shaw Asgilga, Asperla.
I'd like to introduce Liz Gillis, who is our speaker here tonight, who is one of the most well-known historians within the south of Ireland. And as I say, she is very much into the Civil War. And I know Liz has wrote about 5 books. And I met Liz many years ago down in Dundalk. I think it was about 2016. I was going to say 1916. I feel that old. No.
I wish.
It was about 2016, and it was down in Dundalk Jail. And I actually said to Liz one time down at that, I would love to get her up to do a talk. It has taken us this time because of COVID and stuff like that to get her up. So hope everybody will enjoy what Liz is going to tell us. So Liz, thanks very much for coming along. And thanks very much.
Thank you. Firstly, just want to say a huge thanks to Tim for the invitation to come up and do the talk, and thank you all for turning out tonight for the talk. But yeah, Tim said that I'm into the Civil War. I'm fascinated by the Civil War, and sort of that is the period that I've dedicated the last sort of 20-odd years researching, and even though I know a lot, we're only scratching the surface. So it's an overview of the Civil War. I could talk to you for days about just the fighting in Dublin in that week between June and July 1922. So this is just a brief explanation of what happened in those 11 months between 1922 and 1923 that we're still dealing with the effects of it 100 years on. But I want to start with this photograph. And it is a photograph of the wedding of the decade. And it's the wedding between Leslie Price and Tom Barry. Now, I'm just going to get up here and make sure I don't fall. So here we have Tom Barry, who was the legendary commandant of the 3rd West Cork Brigade flying column. There is his bride, Leslie Price, from Dublin originally, coming on out in 1916, but worked with the West Cork Brigade. That's how she would have met Tom Barry. Slap bang in the middle of them, maybe to give an indication of what life would be like in Ireland, there is Eamon de Valera, so between the husband and the wife. But this photograph taken at the back of Vaughan's Hotel, and it is a who's who of the Republican movement. So literally, like I suppose at the end of the First World War, Second World War, those people who had lived through those conflicts when it was over, they get married. Same thing happens after the War of Independence. You have a load of Republicans getting married, but this one, this is the wedding of the decade. But look who is in that photograph. It's a photograph of a huge celebration, a happy day, but it is a very sad photograph because of the people that are in it. Literally, a year from when that photograph was taken, the people in that photograph would be trying to kill each other. And in fact, some of them would die. You have Harry Boland here. Best friend Michael Collins, who died the end of July 1922. To the exact day, a year to the day of this photograph being taken, Michael Collins was to die down in Cork. In December of that year, Sean Hales, whose family were split by the treaty. He was assassinated in Dublin on the 7th of December. The very next day, you have this man, Rory O'Connor, executed as a reprisal. He's one of the Mountjoy Four, executed for the reprisal of the assassination of Sean Hales. So although a photograph of a happy event, it is a very sad photograph, because this represents that split that was to come, that was to devastate this country. But why did that civil war happen? And it was because of this, the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty on the 6th of December 1921. The treaty that cemented partition. It wasn't about partition, because partition had come into existence with the Government of Ireland Act. But this treaty that was signed by Griffith and Collins and Gavin Duffy and Robert Barrett and Eamon Duggan, brought home to Ireland, it divided the Republican movement right down the middle into pro and anti-treaty factions. I don't know if any of you have read the treaty debates. They're online, oireachtas.ie. They're fascinating to look at, but they are heartbreaking to read, because you are literally seeing friendships breaking down in front of your eyes. One thing that was said during the treaty debates and later is that the women were the ones that caused the Civil War. They were the diehards in the treaty debates. They were the ones that made the emotional and irrational speeches and rattled the bones of the dead. Everyone was emotional at that time, and it certainly wasn't just the women that rattled the bones of the dead. When the treaty was put to the Dáil, narrowly it was passed, 64 votes in favour, 57 against, but the Republican movement splits. We have Sinn Féin splitting into pro and anti-treaty factions. So here we have the photograph on the left is the pro-treaty members, Collins, W.T. Cosgrave, Arthur Griffith and so on. And then we have the anti-treaty members of Sinn Féin. Now, Cathal Brugha, De Valera, Mary McSweeney, Kathleen Clark. But what is really sinister about this photograph, you can see the numbers above each of the people. This photograph would have been used as for intelligence during the Civil War to identify who was actually who. So tactics that were used by Collins's intelligence agents during the War of Independence, where you'd have similar photographs of G-men and British intelligence operatives, where they'd have the numbers and then there'd be a name beside the number. They were then using the same tactics against their former friends. When it comes to the actual military groupings, so the IRA split down the middle. Here we see members of the National Army, the pro-treaty IRA, who would become the National Army. What's interesting about this photograph, if you look at the footage or the photographs taken at that time, where this photograph shows them taking over Beggars Bush Barracks, because obviously the British left the barracks all around the country, except in Dublin. The barracks were handed over to only units that were pro-treaty. Around the rest of the country, literally, it was whoever was in charge of the area at the time, so it didn't matter if it was pro or an anti-treaty commander. But in Dublin, the British insisted they had to be pro-treaty supporters. But it was such a small unit at that time, because the majority of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA went anti-treaty. It's only the 2nd Battalion, Thomas Ennis's battalion, as in Thomas Ennis, who is very, very close to Michael Collins. He goes pro-treaty, so the majority of his men follow him. But the majority of the rest, with an exception of the 4th Battalion, a few in the 4th Battalion, they do go anti-treaty. So, for propaganda purposes, they use the same group of fellas. So it's the same 50 or so fellas that you see time and time again marching into the barracks, going around a few times to make it look like a bigger number of men than are actually there. But leading that group is Paddy O'Daly. And if any of you know anything about the Civil War, he is synonymous with the events that happened in Kerry in March 1923. We'll talk about that in a bit. You've got Joe Leonard in there, Pádraig O'Connor, fellas that either would have been members of the Active Service Unit in Dublin or members of the squad, Collins's assassins. In relation to the IRA itself, though, as I've mentioned, the majority of the Dublin Brigade went anti-treaty. That was pretty much across the board. The pro-treaty side were completely outnumbered 10-1 by the ranks of the anti-treaty IRA. Cumann, they were the first group to actually have a convention and discuss whether they as a group would accept or reject the treaty. That happened in February 1922. There were representatives from all over the country, and overwhelmingly they rejected the treaty. The IRA, where this photograph is taken in April 1922. This is members of the 1st Southern Division, Liam Lynch's first row in the centre, but that was taken after the convention in March, where the IRA overwhelmingly rejected the treaty, and that photograph is taken in April at another one of their meetings. So you can see here, Cumann, the IRA, and later na Fianna, they all rejected the treaty. So here's some of the political figureheads. So we have Eamon de Valera anti-treaty, Arthur Griffith pro-treaty, and although the treaty was signed in December 1921 and the Civil War doesn't break out until June 1922. In that 6-month period, there's a lot going on, and there's a difference in attitude between the politicians and the military men. So you have Arthur Griffith. In March, there was a standoff down in Limerick, and it looked like civil war was going to break out. And Arthur Griffith is saying, look, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Just get it over and done with. You have de Valera turning up at rallies, anti-treaty rallies, where he's saying, to paraphrase, men must wade through Irish blood. So they're inciting people to fight. Certainly Eamon de Valera is. But the thing is, Eamon de Valera at this stage loses control of the military men. Liam Lynch, he actually takes control. They separate really from the politicians, and the IRA, the anti-treaty side, reverts that independent stance they had in 1919. But what de Valera is saying, he is saying to men who have killed for the Republic to kill again. But when the fighting actually does happen, he is horrified by this. But he was making those speeches in the build-up, and while he is doing that, you have the military men trying to stop it. So people like Cathal Brugha, who was seen as a diehard, but on the anti-treaty side, before the Civil War begins, he is trying to stop the split. He is trying to recover the group. Liam Lynch, who is the commandant of the anti-treaty IRA, again seen as a diehard, certainly when it starts, but up to that point, he had been trying to heal that split. Collins, again, once it starts, there's no going back, but he was trying to bring the two sides together through various committees and groups, but it all came to no avail. But you can see there is a difference in attitude, because at least with Brugha, certainly, Liam Lynch, Collins, they'd all fought for the Republic. De Valera had in 1916. Arthur Griffith wasn't out in 1916. However, there is a difference in attitude, because these men know once you cross that line, there's no going back. You then have a split within the ranks of the anti-treaty IRA. So just to go back to Brugha and Liam Lynch, the treaty had to be put to the people. They had to vote on whether they would accept it or reject it. And Brugha and both Liam Lynch were putting their faith in that. Liam Lynch especially was putting his faith in the Republican Constitution, the Free State Constitution, that had to be written under the terms of the treaty. The IRB wrote the Constitution. It was acceptable to the anti-treaty side, but of course the British, they would not accept it. The election, Brugha believed that the people had the right to their vote, and they as representatives of the people then should follow what the people would say or would want. So you have within the ranks of the anti-treaty IRA people like Rory O'Connor, people like Liam Mellows, you have Ernie O'Malley, Simon Donnelly and many others who believe that they are too moderate, and the IRA, the fighting men, know what is best. And there's that split. So you have the leadership emerging of Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows, and are what become known as the IRA executive. So they are literally in control of the Dublin garrison, and they take over the forecourts in April 1922. And what you have in Dublin at this time is the anti-treaty IRA executive have their headquarters in the forecourts. Liam Lynch and Kettle Brewett, the other side of the anti-treaty IRA, have their headquarters across the water in the Clarence Hotel. And then you have Collins and the other pro-treaty leadership, and they're based in Portobello Barracks, Burgers Bush Barracks, and so on. So you've got three groups, all calling themselves the IRA, but there's this massive split. It's very, very confusing. And then later on, there's another group calling themselves the IRA, who are the neutrals, who are completely overlooked in this conflict, because they knew that nothing was worth fighting each other for. And they were trying to find a way to end the Civil War. Now, they were set up when it began, and both the pro and anti-treaty side turned against them, saw them as cowards, that they didn't take a stance. But in my mind, they were very brave men, because they knew that, again, crossing that line, they were sacrificing the future of the country. So, the forecourts. You had the anti-treaty executive. They had been in Parnell Square, 41 Parnell Square, and they needed bigger premises. So the night of the 14th of April 1922, they decide to take over the forecourts. Now, this was really putting up to the provisional government. They took it over with ease. They just climbed over the gates and just walked in. You have roughly about 180 men altogether occupy the forecourts. Now, that's April 1922. Again, Civil War doesn't begin for another 6-7 weeks. Now, obviously, it made the newspapers. Rory O'Connor, who was in the forecourts with the executive, there is a press release that it's not a coup. But you can only imagine what the provisional government were thinking, that they take over pretty much the last symbol of British authority in Dublin, certainly, with the exception of Dublin Castle, because every other building had been destroyed in either 1916 or the War of Independence. But the government don't act. So you've got Griffith asking Collins, or pushing Collins, can't let this happen. This is a huge insult, and we're looking weak here if we don't do anything against them. The reality of the situation is that they couldn't. So physically, as I mentioned earlier, the anti-treaty IRA outnumbered the pro-treaty side at least 10-1. You've got hardened veterans of the War of Independence that are anti-treaty. The provisional government, the National Army, they actually couldn't trust the men they had in the army to stay on that side. You have a lot of fellas that join up, Sean Lamass, Simon Donnelly and many others who switch sides. They are pro-treaty first. Again, a bit like Brewer, that they're waiting, Liam Lynch, they're waiting for that constitution to be published and waiting for what the people say. But then they switch sides. So the National Army actually could not trust its members to stay on that side. The other thing is that the anti-treaty side were very, very well armed, thanks to the capture of the Upnor warship. And you can see from this roughly what the anti-treaty IRA now had in their grasp, which was 1,500 rifles, 55 Lewis guns, 6 Maxim guns, 3 Vickers, 500,000 rounds of ammunition, 1,000 each revolvers, and .455 automatic pistols with ammunition, 300 hand grenades and some rifle grenade throwers. That is what they captured with the Upnor. So the provisional government, the National Army, really were not in a position to act against the forecourts garrison, because the fear was, if they did, pretty much the anti-treaty IRA from all over the country would just encircle Dublin and they'd be wiped out very, very quickly. So Collins knew that and was not willing to take that chance. Now you have, of course, pressure coming from the British, from Churchill, to get them out, do something about it, but Collins resisted. Now, what were they doing in the forecourts? I love these photographs. These were taken during that 2-month period, but in the lead up to the outbreak of the war. And you can see that these men don't look like they're ready for war. They don't believe that conflict is going to break out. Now, this photograph on the left, on my left, is the armoured car, the Mutineer, which was stolen and given to the anti-treaty IRA. Ernie O'Malley brought it up, and that was used in the Battle of the Four Courts. It was actually one of the most important weapons that they had when the battle does actually break out. But here you have members of the Four Courts garrison. In that photograph, I think it is this chap here, is Commandant Paddy O'Brien, who was the man that was meant to be actually in charge of the garrison, and was meant to be doing all the ordering and telling the fellas where to go. He was certainly hampered in his work by the fact that the IRA executive were there with him, O'Connor, Mellows and others. Now, this other photograph, you can see it's the lads and they're posing with guns. There's only a few sandbags. They hadn't got enough sandbags. They started to dig a tunnel, but then stopped digging the tunnel. So you can see from these photographs that conflict isn't inevitable. It doesn't look like the war will break out. And I really love this photograph. This is Paddy Rigney, 4th Battalion, and there he is lying across the roof of the Four Courts, posing. So this is not a person that thinks the conflict is going to happen. They can find some way out of it. But it was not to be, because you do have a number of events that eventually lead to the inevitable happening. So we have the assassination of Henry Wilson by members of the London IRA on orders of Collins that had been given a couple of years beforehand. The Four Courts garrison were blamed for this attack. They had nothing to do with it. But this gives Churchill the actual, I suppose, authority to demand that the provisional government do something against the Four Courts garrison. And if they don't, he will. And he orders the military, General Macready, to attack the Four Courts. Now, General Macready knew that if they did that, that could actually reunite the pro-anti-treaty factions. So, hold off. He was able to convince Churchill not to do it. Collins's hand is finally pushed or forced with this event. And you have a series of events that happen on the 26th of June. So you have an anti-treaty IRA volunteer, Leo Henderson. I always get him and Frank mixed up. But the anti-treaty IRA had renewed the Belfast boycott, whereas that boycott on northern businesses, and it was trying to sort of undermine the establishment of the state of the north. But he was doing a raid on a garage because they needed cars. But there was a raid by the National Army on Ferguson's garage, and Henderson was arrested. In response to this, the anti-treaty executive, including Ernie O'Malley, a group of them go out and they're looking for someone from the National Army side that they can actually kidnap. And they end up kidnapping Ginger O'Connell, a person very, very close to Collins. So this now Collins would see that it's a personal attack. It's too close to home. This is the act that actually forces Collins to act. And an ultimatum is then sent to the garrison in the Four Courts. So Tom Ennis, the leader of the 2nd Battalion, the man who, it's his unit that predominantly accept the treaty, he issues this ultimatum to the Four Courts garrison, where it says, I, acting under the order of the government, hereby order you to evacuate the buildings of the Four Courts and to parade your men under arrest without arms on that portion of the quays immediately in front of the Four Courts by 4 a.m. Failing compliance with this order, the building will be taken by me by force, and you and all concerned with you will be held responsible for any life lost or any damage done. By order, Tom Ennis. There was no response from the Four Courts garrison. And at 7 minutes past 4 in the morning of the 28th of June 1922, the bombardment of the Four Courts begins. 4 18-pounder guns were given to the National Army 3 18-pounders were used against the forecourt garrison. Now, if you look at the photographs of that attack, you'll always see 2 18-pounders, the one sort of facing the forecourts from across the Liffey, but there was another one. And it was used sort of at the side and the rear, to attack the side and the rear of the forecourts. From one gun alone, over 1,200 shells were fired in that 3-day period, because the battle only lasts 3 days. The forecourts bombardment, it lasts 3 days. But this is what the people of Dublin, the people of Ireland, woke up to. Yet again, there's another war on the streets of Dublin, except now it is former friends fighting against each other. The National Army pretty much completely encircled the forecourts, because, a bit like in 1916, the anti-treaty garrison hadn't got enough men to take over key positions surrounding the forecourts. Like, they took over the Forecourts Hotel, which was right beside the forecourts, but ended up leaving it. So where they are based in the forecourts is the main part on the Liffey side, the headquarters block, which is at the back, which would be facing the Bridewell, and then what was the Public Records Office. So that was the munitions factory. And that was where you had all the gelignite and the dynamite and all the explosives. But in that building, the people guarding that building were members of Na Fianna. And Sean Lemass had a huge problem with this, because here you had lads 16, 17, 18 years of age who were in the worst part of the complex, the most dangerous part of the complex. You've got National Army snipers in St Michan's Tower, also the tower at Jemison's in Smithfield, and then of course they're being attacked from the front by the 18-pounders. Now, National Army weren't too experienced. One National Army soldier ended up using, or was trying to use, the 18-pounder gun as a sniper rifle. You have accounts where there's an anti-treaty lad on the roof of the forecourt and he's trying to hit him with the 18-pounder gun. They took chunks out of the wall of the Liffey, but also you see there's an amazing photograph from the Church Street side, and the 18-pounder gun was probably where that wall is, and the building, the forecourt, was where that wall is. That's how close the 18-pounder was to it, and was just pummelling it. And it just makes a massive, massive hole in what is known as the Public Records Office. The armoured car that the anti-treaty IRA had, it was capable of holding back the attack, but then that's put out of action. And once that happens, then you see the National Army getting closer and closer and closer. They do make their way into the complex. They are in the complex before the Public Records Office goes up. This photograph shows that explosion. So that's the first explosion. Now, I can't say who actually did blow up the Public Records Office, that building that housed all of these priceless records, because there are varying accounts. Simon Donnelly says that it was a fire that spread. Pádraig O'Connor, who was National Army, is actually the soldier that left an account, because he was the one that got into the breach. He was going into the building when the building went up. So the Free State soldiers are in the complex when it goes up. After this massive explosion, you have calls on to surrender by Paddy O'Daly. They must give up their guns. They won't. But then a short time later, on the 30th of June, so it was the afternoon, you have a second explosion going up. Paddy O'Brien, during this time, really as soon as the bombardment began, was trying to say to the leadership, firstly, get out, let me control everything, let's basically blow up the building and get out, revert to the tactics that were so successful for us in the War of Independence. But Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows wouldn't do it. They were reacting to a situation. They weren't proactive in their decision-making. Liam Mellows believed if they left the forecourts, it would be abandoning the Republic, so they stay. Paddy O'Brien is wounded in the explosion. He's taken away. He was later killed down in Wexford. But a second explosion rocks through the building, and they have no other option. They have to surrender. Now, what is really sort of sad about this is that you have men that are in the forecourts in 1922 that had been in the forecourts in 1916. So Patrick Breslin, for example, who was to die in October 1922 in Mountjoy, for the second time, he has to surrender from that building. They destroy their arms and they march out, and then they are marched to Jemieson's distillery in Smithfield and then transported to Mountjoy jail. Now, that is not the fighting in Dublin over, because, very importantly, one of the reasons Collins attacked the forecourts was because he believed that that split that had happened with Cattle Brewer and Liam Lynch and the Anti-Treaty IRA executive, he thought, or the others thought, that that was still alive. They didn't know that that rift had been healed. So Liam Lynch, who had been deposed as commanding officer, was now reinstated. Liam Lynch was actually arrested by the National Army. They had him. And their intelligence wasn't good. They let him go. And he drives off with Liam Deasy, makes his way, heads back down to Cork. And that was the fear that the National Army had, was that if Liam Lynch and all those southern IRA men get involved, we are in trouble. And that's exactly what happens. But in Dublin, the forecourts is gone. However, you had so much fighting all around the city because the other anti-treaty units had been given the order to mobilise. So the occupied buildings on the south side of the city are on the north side, but their main focus then becomes what's called the block. So O'Connell Street, the top half of O'Connell Street, where the Savoy Cinema is now. So literally from Findlater Place all the way down to Cathedral Street, they occupied all those buildings and tunnelled right through, so they're all linked up. So this is literally a replay of 1916. The National Army, they just moved the 18-pounder guns from the forecourts to O'Connell Street. And you have all those other buildings that had been occupied one by one, they're taken. The National Army do what the British did in 1916. They literally focused their attention on the block, and all the other positions will fall. And that's what happens. The 18-pounder gun is positioned at Nelson's Pillar, where the spire is today. You've got the armoured cars protecting it, and they just shell the hell out of the block. And you can see here the damage that was done. Now, in the block, you had a group of about 100 men and women, about 70 men, 30 members of Cumann on. Leading them was Cattle Brewer. Cattle Brewer, once the fighting starts, like Liam Lynch, he was going to see it through to the end. As I said, one by one the buildings fall, and the block becomes so small because each of the buildings, they catch fire. They begin to collapse because of the bombardment. And Brewer realises that they will all die, so he tells everyone to leave. And he is the last one that's in the building. By this time, just to go back, so you can see the Granville Hotel was the last position. So this is on the 5th of July, 1922. So all of these buildings here and here were gone, and it's just the Granville that is left. By this time, the National Army were in this laneway right behind the block, so they're as close as you can get. The garrison that is there, the small garrison, Brewer orders them to leave. They go out through the laneway and they run into the National Army soldiers. There's questions, where's Brewer, where's Brewer? And then Brewer emerges from the doorway. He had guns in his hand, and just calls them to surrender. Brewer didn't. The soldiers were ordered to fire, but to aim low, so as to maim, not kill. He was shot in the leg, but the bullet severed ephemeral artery. Linda Cairns was a nurse who was there at the time. She goes to him, she tries to save him, he's brought to the Mater Hospital. There were signs that night that it looked like that he could pull through, but on the 7th of July 1922, Cattle Brewer, he died. What British bullets and bombs and grenades could not do in 1916, it took one bullet from an Irishman to kill Cattle Brewer. Now, with his death, the battle for Dublin was over pretty much. The fighting in Dublin did continue, but the National Army then realised it isn't ended in Dublin. We now have the country to deal with. So we have to go south. We need to get more men. So you have a mass recruitment drive put out, and the National Army swells to, like, I think it's 40 or 50,000. And whereas before this happened, if you were joining the National Army, you had to have been a veteran. You had to have fought in the War of Independence. You couldn't be what was called a Truce-a-Lear, as in joined up during the truce and did no fighting. You had to have served, but now that went by the wayside. They needed men, and anyone who wants to join could join. So you don't have loyalty there. Friendships that would have existed pre the Civil War, those ties are diluted. So Liam Lynch, he is now the commanding officer in the south. He is organising attacks. He is telling people to reverse the guerrilla tactics that were so successful, used by the IRA during the War of Independence. And this term comes up, the Munster Republic. Liam Lynch never actually said that it was the Munster Republic, but this is where the fighting becomes concentrated. Now, the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA, were having successes against the National Army. They mined roads. They destroyed railways. It was so unsafe for the army to travel by road, they had to travel by sea. That's how they land all their troops down south. You've got a land in Athena, lots of landings down in Kerry, and all the National Army troops are brought down that way because it was the only way they could do it. But in the initial months of the Civil War, the anti-treaty IRA had a lot of successes against the National Army. Here we have just an example of the situations that you'd be seeing, that you'd be coming up against. Ambushes and landmines, road mines, as I said, bridges and railways destroyed. Now, the Civil War, it did divide families. And I suppose this family is the family that symbolised the tragedy of the Civil War, and it is the Hales family from West Cork. Winda Shakes to Barley is pretty much that family. So you had Sean Hales, the older brother, the eldest brother, and his sister Madge took the pro-treaty side. And then against them were Tom, William, Robert and Donal Hales. Donal was in Italy, but that was a family completely divided. And Tom and Sean Hales in particular were to be involved in two events that changed the way the Civil War was fought and led to horrible acts taking place. Tom being the commanding officer in charge of the ambush party at Bell-na-Blah, and then Sean being assassinated in Dublin. Here we have the last photograph taken of Collins before he was killed. So this is the Munster Arms Hotel in Bandon. It was Lee's Hotel, but it's the Munster Arms today. The hotel is still there. And in August, you have Collins doing his tour of Cork, and he goes around to all the various towns around West Cork, and the last stop he makes is in Bandon, where Sean Hales is the commanding officer of the National Army there. When Collins is leaving Bandon, Sean Hales warns him not to take the road that they had come along or that they were willing to take because it was too dangerous. He knew that there was so much anti-treaty IRA activity around the place. It was too dangerous. Find another way to go, but don't go by Bell-na-Blah. Earlier on, and I suppose it just shows that although Collins had been born in West Cork was not his home because he hadn't lived there since he was 15. He'd lived in England, and then he spent the rest of his time in Dublin. And they had to stop and ask directions when they were driving around West Cork. Unfortunately, the person they asked for directions was a member of the anti-treaty IRA who alerted the local IRA that Collins was in their midst. Hence, Tom Hales was then ordered to basically put in train the ambush that was going to happen. So here you have Collins seeing Sean Hales, and Sean Hales is warning him, don't go that way, while Sean's brother Tom is overseeing the ambush where Collins will be the one that will die. So this is the last photograph taken of Collins before he died. And there they are, the two brothers. So we know that Collins was killed at Bell-na-Blah. This event had a huge impact. because immediately the National Army react and they respond and they send out a message. And who they send the message out to is Na Fianna. Na Fianna, as I said, went anti-treaty, but it seems to have been after the Civil War broke out. They'd had a meeting and they decided that they were anti-treaty, they would throw in their lot with the anti-treaty side. 4 days after Collins is killed, you have 2 members of Na Fianna taken off the streets of Dublin in broad daylight, and they're brought out to a place called Yellow Lane on the north side of Dublin, and they were murdered in front of a lot of people by what can only be called a murder gang. You have the military intelligence unit, the Oriel House gang, and they begin to operate from this period, and they commit an awful lot of atrocities during the Civil War, but this is like the first one. And it was sending a message to Na Fianna to stop, because like during the War of Independence, like I suppose 1916, once a member of Na Fianna hit a certain age, they automatically went into the ranks of the IRA. So there was that constant stream of young men going into the ranks of the anti-treaty IRA. And they weren't the only members. They were the first of many members of Na Fianna to be targeted, Sean Cole and Alf Colley. But that is 4 days after Collins dies. Despite this, the Fianna are still active, and the anti-treaty side continue to have a lot of successes. So they've gotten the big one, Collins. You have Tom Keogh, who is killed in a trap mine in September in Cork. So the pro-treaty side are losing a lot of men. To stop this, you have emergency legislation being brought in, because politicians are starting to be targeted, or families of politicians, pro-treaty politicians, were beginning to be targeted. And basically this emergency legislation, it allowed the establishment of military courts. So the army would try people. Although the civic police force, the civic guard, was set up, it was the army that were basically the law at that time. So what this legislation meant was, if you were found with a gun, or if you're found with ammunition or explosives, then you could be tried and you could be executed. So it's introduced in September 1922, known as the Murder Bill by the anti-treaty side. As I said to you, those first reprisals of Cole and Colley, the murder of Cole and Colley, it was the first. It certainly wasn't the last. And one of the worst events, most tragic events that happened during the Civil War, is what has become known as the Red Cow murders, where you have 3 young men, definitely 2 are members of Na Fianna, Edwin Hughes and Brendan Houlihan. Joseph Rogers in the middle. We're just not certain if he was Na Fianna. We do know they were all neighbours. But these 3 men, young men, Rogers was only 16, Houlihan and Hughes were only 17. But they were, again, sort of kidnapped or taken into custody, because what had happened at this time in October 1922, with the emergency legislation being brought in, with the sort of reprisals that were taking place, you have like a propaganda war going on. But the anti-treaty side were putting up posters all over the place, and one of the posters that these lads were putting up was a threat to the National Army. And pretty much what it said was that anyone seen in this vicinity, which was Drumcondra, on the north side of Dublin, anyone seen in Free State uniform in this area will be shot on sight. Now, they actually weren't meant to put up the posters. Originally, it was a young member of Cumann, Jenny O'Toole. She was putting them up, but she got attacked. And the lads saw this, so they said, look, we'll put up the posters for you. 3 neighbours, as I said. Unfortunately, as they're going to put up the posters, a car pulls up full of National Army soldiers, including Charlie Dalton, Nicky Tobin and others. Charlie Dalton was their neighbour. He lived just up the road. So he stops them, searches them, sees the poster, and literally what it's saying is, if they see him, they're going to kill him. Apparently, one had a gun. So they're taken into custody. They're brought to Wellington Barracks, which is on the South Circular Road. It's now Griffith College. And the next thing Their bodies are found the next morning out at the Red Cow. Joseph Rogers was shot 16 times. No one ever stood trial for their murder. Their families never got justice. But this is one of the most tragic events of the Civil War, one of many. Going back to that murder bill, as the anti-treaty side called it, although it's brought in September, the first executions don't happen until November, and it is of these 4 lads, 4 unknown fellas. Actually 4 fellas from my neck of the woods, the Liberties, Peter Cassidy, James Fisher, John Gaffney and Richard Toohey. Now, oh my God, there's a brilliant file in the military archives, and it's the National Army raid books. And literally night after night, as the raids were being carried out, they had to fill out the addresses of where they raided, did he get anyone, did he get anything. And looking through it, I found the raids of these 4 lads. And they were on the radar of the authorities. They were all neighbours, all from very close proximity to each other in Dublin 8. But it's Gaffney and I think Toohey. They called the house, and in the book it says, no one found, they're not there. And then you turn the page, and then it says, basically, we got them. Because as the patrol moves off, they run into them and they arrest them. Now, they were found with guns, so that meant they could be tried under this legislation. The thing was, they were 4 unknowns. And I believe that they were sacrificed because the National Army or the government had Erskine Childers in custody. And he wants to execute Erskine Childers. He was found with a gun given to him by Michael Collins. However, it was known how much a lot of people hated Erskine Childers. So if they executed him, it could be used against the government that it was personal, it wasn't under this legislation. So they basically shoot 4 unknowns, and the message is, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're found with a gun, then this is what can happen to you. James Fisher's last letter to his mother, it's heartbreaking. It's on the website for Cumann Jail. And in it he's saying to her, I'm ready to die for Ireland, I'm willing to give up my life for Ireland, but if only I could see you one last time, mother, 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 mother. A young boy, being a man, dying for his country. And they were executed in Cumann Jail. The first executions since those of the Easter Rising leaders in 1916. And then we come to Sean Hale. So Tom had been involved in that event, as in the ambush where Collins dies. And then we have Sean Hales, who was up in Dublin, going to the Dáil. Now, although he was a Brigadier General in the National Army, he was also a politician. And the anti-treaty, Liam Lynch had sent out an order that any politician that voted for that murder bill, they were liable, or they were likely, or they were a legitimate target. They could be assassinated. The order went out, if you see them, you shoot them. Sean Hales had not voted on that legislation. He was in the Ormond Hotel in Dublin. He was visiting Pádraig O'Malley, who was the last Count Corla. He had voted for that legislation. But Sean Hales was wanting a full investigation into what had happened at Ballinablaw. He didn't necessarily believe the official version of events, because apparently he had met Tom, his brother, after the ambush. So he's calling for an investigation, but he never gets to it all. As he and O'Malley are coming out of the Ormond Hotel, a Jarvie pulls up, O'Malley gets in, but then he was called back. Someone he knew recognised him. He gets off to talk. Sean Hales moves further into the Jarvie, and literally at that moment, anti-treaty IRA men come out of the laneway surrounding the Ormond, open fire. O'Malley is wounded, but Sean Hales bears the brunt. He was brought to Jervis Street Hospital, which what would be like a minute away, but that was too long. He was gone before they got to Jervis Street Hospital. What happens the next day is completely unjustified, it was completely illegal, and it was the execution of the Mountjoy Four. And this was sending a message to the anti-treaty IRA. One side is going to win, and it's not going to be us. This quote is from W.T. Cosgrave, the president of the Provisional Government, the Free State. And what he said is that the night before Hales was assassinated, he and Richard Mulcahy were talking about giving an offer of clemency to the anti-treaty IRA. They had done it before. But after the assassination of Hales, he says, there was only one way to meet this campaign, he said, and that was to smash it. Now, these four men, Dick Barrett, Joe McKelvey, Liam Mellows, Rory O'Connor, had nothing to do with this policy because they had been in custody. They'd been in Mountjoy jail since the forecourt was taken on the 30th of June 1922. They had nothing to do with it. They each represented a province of the island. Joe McKelvey represents Ulster, Dick Barrett, Munster, Liam Mellows was Connacht, and Rory O'Connor was Leinster. And they are taken out and they are executed by firing squad as a reprisal for the assassination of Sean Hales. What is all the more tragic about this is Dick Barrett shouldn't have been there. He should have left with Liam Lynch. He was from West Cork. He and Sean Hales were actually very close friends. And certainly the Hales family didn't support this action. So you can see that it just gets worse and worse and worse. And bringing it to Rory O'Connor, Kevin O'Higgins, seen here. This photograph is of his wedding in 1921. Rory O'Connor was his best man. And Kevin O'Higgins is, it is said, the last one to basically agree to the execution of Rory O'Connor. So you can see how close it got. January, February, it was just getting worse and worse and worse. You do have another appeal for clemency, or the government are putting out an appeal, you know, dump your arms and we'll end it. You have those in custody that if they sign a form promising not to take up arms against the government, they will be released. But the nature of the war is descending, and then we have what is called the Terror Month in March down in Kerry. Paddy O'Daly, who I mentioned, the Dublin Guards, they were down in Kerry, and it was really vicious down in Kerry. The fighting was so vicious down in Kerry. But you have a National Army officer, Paddy Pats O'Connor, who was a member or from Kerry, who was particularly aggressive against the anti-treaty IRA in Kerry. He knew who the fellows were because they were his neighbours. This feud, or the events that happen in March, early March 1923, it's all because of personalities, a personal clash between anti-treaty IRA members and Paddy Pats O'Connor's family. He joins the National Army and he goes after the fellas that had literally terrorised his father. But now he becomes a threat, or the anti-treaty side wants to deal with him. So word goes out that there's a cache of arms hidden in a place called Knocknagoshel. But the arms dump was booby-trapped. So Paddy Pats O'Connor goes with a unit of the National Army, which included two lads from Dublin who are veterans of the War of Independence, who are very close sorry, to Paddy O'Daly. And when they go, they look and open the cache, and an explosion basically rockets through and they're killed. Now, the response to this, it's not the fact that Paddy Pats O'Connor was killed, it is more to do with the fact that the two Dublin lads are killed because they had been friends of Paddy O'Daly, and Paddy O'Daly was determined to make all of Kerry pay for what happened at Knocknagoshel. So that night, you have 9 prisoners, anti-treaty prisoners, taken out of Ballymullen Barracks. They had been tortured, they had been beaten, and they're brought to a place called Ballyseedy Woods, and they are tied around a mine. They're told they're cleared in a roadblock, but of course the roadblock had been mined. And the National Army just set off the detonator and the explosion happens. 8 prisoners died. 1, Stephen Fuller, was blown clear away, managed to survive, manages to make his way to safety. Pretty much at the same time, you have 5 prisoners being taken out of another prison, and they're brought to Countess Bridge in Killarney. And the same thing happens. They're to clear a roadblock, they're placed around the mine, and the mine goes off. There's another survivor. 4 people are killed there, there's 1 survivor. There was so much devastation at Ballyseedy that they didn't know who was who, because it was just pieces. There are awful accounts of this, but then word got out because the official word obviously was that prisoners were cleared in this roadblock that the anti-treaty IRA had set. There was a bomb there and it went off. It was pure lies. Word gets out that actually they had been murdered. This was a trap set by the National Army. But you have 3 Kerry brigades. And as I said, Paddy O'Daly and the National Army are determined to make all of Kerry pay. So you have the Kerry number 1, Kerry number 2, Kerry number 3 brigades, all hit. Bahawk's workhouse, prisoners again taken out. And to ensure that there were no survivors, the prisoners were shot in the legs first and then placed on the mine, and then they were blown up. And you can see that it warrants the name Terror Month. In the space of 2 weeks, you have something like 26 people being killed, and it all starts with that trap mine in Knocknagoshel, and here you see just one account of it. Now, De Valera is trying to get the anti-treaty IRA to stop, to lay down their arms to end it. Liam Lynch would not have any of it. But Liam Lynch then is fatally wounded in the Knockmeal Down Mountains on the 10th of April 1923. When Liam Lynch dies, that is that sort of resistance to compromise gone. And Eamon De Valera and Frank Aiken, they take control. Eamon De Valera wins back political control of the anti-treaty IRA, and then the anti-treaty IRA on the 24th of May lay down their arms. There is no battle that ends the Civil War. You just have Eamon De Valera issuing the order to lay down your arms and save them for another day. So although the Civil War ended, the harassment didn't, because you have so many anti-treaty men and women in the prisons, but the raids continue long after the Civil War ends, and actually you still have the killings taking place after the Civil War ends. Again, another tragic event is the murder of Noel Lamass. He had gotten away during the Civil War. He was meant to be involved in the shooting of 2 National Army soldiers. He sends letters back from England saying he wants to come home. He's not going to have any hand or part in this. He just wants to live a normal life. And in July 1923, so the Civil War ends in May, he's walking through town, and again the car pulls up and he's kidnapped. And then October 1923, his remains are found in the featherbeds in the Dublin Mountains. Again, no one ever faced justice for his murder. So although the Civil War ends, you can see that the harassment doesn't. And in the prisons, the harassment continues. About 13,000 men and women were imprisoned after the Civil War. And they go on a hunger strike, A, against the treatment that they were receiving, but also why were they being interned? Because a lot of them were arrested not for doing that, just for being part of the groups. So a hunger strike does begin, and you have the effects of that hunger strike being felt on people for many, many years, and tragically a lot of people die very young because of the treatment they received. But that is an overview of the Civil War. It's scratching the surface, but a conflict that lasted 11 months, when you think of it, I suppose one of the ultimate tragedies of it is that what the British couldn't do in the years 1916, in the War of Independence, we ended up doing to ourselves. The giants of the revolution that the British could not get, Brewer, Collins, Sean Hales, Erskine Childers, Liam Lynch, Roy O'Connor, Arthur Griffith, all of those people, all fallen at the hands of their fellow friends. But I won't end on that. I'm going to end on this story, because not all friendships sort of failed. We go back to Patrick O'Connor and Paddy Rigney. So, best friends in the War of Independence. These two fellas, where you saw one, you saw the other, they were like each other's shadows. Served in the 4th Battalion together. Patrick O'Connor, pro-treaty. Paddy Rigney, anti-treaty. Patrick O'Connor goes into the Four Courts. He is the 1st National Army soldier into the Four Courts. His friend Paddy Rigney is in the Four Courts. When the surrender happened and the garrison were taken to the Jemieson's distillery in Smithfield, amongst the sea of faces, Patrick O'Connor sees his friend Paddy Rigney, and he manages to get word to him to basically say, I've left the door open for you, get out, save yourself. Just hoping that Rigney would get out. But Rigney tells a few other people, like Sean Lamass and Ernie O'Malley and a few others, and they all walk out and they continue to fight another day. But these two men, despite their political differences, their friendship survived the Civil War and beyond. And then this photograph, which is a powerful photograph. Here you have IRA men, veterans, at the unveiling of the memorial to Michael Collins at Sam's Cross in 1965. But look who was in the photograph. Here you have Tom Hales, so the man who oversaw the ambush where Collins was killed. Beside him, Vinnie Bourne, one of Collins' assassins pro-treaty. Here we have Joe McGuinness, another one of Collins' assassins pro-treaty. There you have Liam Deasy, Liam Lynch's right-hand man, as in anti-treaty. Tom Barry, just there. Paddy Lawson, just there. So these are men who literally would have killed each other 40 years before, now brought together. And the one thing that brought them together was their admiration of their fallen leader, Michael Collins. Thank you.